todos y a todas. Estáis en la Fundación Pastor, eso que quede claro. Es decir, estáis en vuestra casa, porque la Fundación Pastor se siente extraordinariamente honrada de la celebración de este evento, de este acto, de este coloquio en torno al Papiro de Ezequiel. Dentro de las pequeñas cosas que tenemos en la Fundación Pastor y que merecen el interés de los estudiosos, sin lugar a dudas la colección de papiros antiguos es nuestra joya de la corona, una joya pequeñita de una corona pequeñita, pero es la joya de la corona, ¿no? Y dentro de la joya de la corona, como todos ustedes saben, el papiro de Ezequiel es, sin lugar a dudas, nuestra posesión más valiosa, incluso más valiosa que este maravilloso edificio en uno de los mejores lugares de Madrid. A mí todavía me parece más importante el papiro de Ezequiel que el edificio. Otros no estarán de acuerdo conmigo, pero bueno, peor para ellos. Por ese motivo, el papiro de Ezequiel, lo saben todos ustedes, desde muy pronto la Fundación Pastor, consciente del extraordinario valor de ese papiro, decidió depositarlo en la Biblioteca Nacional por razones de seguridad y de conservación. Y creemos que en ese sentido ha sido un total acierto, porque el papiro sigue gozando de buena salud, cosa que no suele ocurrir siempre, ¿no? La Biblioteca Nacional ha hecho un trabajo extraordinario de conservación y además este año nos ha dado la oportunidad de poder exhibirlo al gran público y naturalmente pues para nosotros eso es un orgullo extraordinario. Bien es cierto que la Biblioteca Nacional no hubiera podido hacerlo si no hubiera contado con la ayuda de las comisarias de la exposición, Sofía y Raquel, que afortunadamente forman parte también, Sofía como patrona y Raquel como, en fin, como amiga íntima, digámoslo así, forman parte de la Fundación Pastor. Y es que no hace falta que yo las presente, son dos extraordinarias papirólogas que además pues tienen una red de relaciones internacionales, bueno, pues en este sentido, en el ámbito de la papirología, la mejor que se pueda tener. Y por ese motivo, hoy podemos celebrar aquí este coloquio en el que contamos nada más y nada menos que con las personas Unkel de la Scheide Library, Eric White de Princeton University, Giorgos Boudalis del Museo bizantino de Tesalónica, Brent Nongbri de Oslo y Roberta Mazza. Es que no me he puesto las gafas y no leo bien. Y Roberta Mazza de la Università di Bologna. Bueno, yo creo que para abrir el apetito es un menú más que simpático y más que extraordinario, y creo que vamos a pasar un rato magnífico. Esta fundación fue creada en el año 1954. Es decir, tiene 71 años de antigüedad. A mí me gusta decir, aparte de que 1954 es un año importantísimo en los anales de la historia de la humanidad, porque es el año en que yo nací, es también el año en el que se creó la Fundación Hart. La Fundación Hart de Estudios Clásicos de Ginebra se creó exactamente el mismo año que la Fundación Pastor y con la misma finalidad. No me quiero extender en los motivos que tuvo el barón Kurt von Hart para crear esa fundación, tampoco me voy a extender en los motivos del don Antonio Pastor de la Meden para crear esta, pero más o menos eran los mismos. Y la convicción de que los estudios clásicos en toda su dimensión, en toda su amplitud, es algo que no se debe perder nunca dentro de la cultura occidental, porque son lo que constituyen nuestra raíz más esencial, la raíz que cohesiona la cultura occidental, ¿no? En este sentido, pues naturalmente el hecho de que Penélope Fotiades donara a la fundación, tampoco me voy a meter en las circunstancias de ese hecho, en los años 60 esta colección de unos 350 papiros a la Fundación Pastor, pues naturalmente es algo que nos honra extraordinariamente y de lo que nos sentimos absolutamente orgullosos. De manera que todo el esfuerzo que podamos hacer dentro de nuestras modestas posibilidades por promocionar, conservar, estudiar, difundir el conocimiento de la fundación de los papiri matritenses, pues naturalmente estamos dispuestos a hacerlo, incluso aunque el presidente de la Fundación Pastor sea un catedrático de latín. Es decir, eso tampoco va a ser un inconveniente en este momento, ¿de acuerdo? Y nada más, le cedo la palabra a Raquel y a Sofía, que son las que verdaderamente van a coordinar el acto. Muchas gracias a todos.
¿Yo? Sí. Bueno, bienvenidos a todos. Vamos a explicar brevemente en castellano cómo se va a desarrollar este acto para luego dar la palabra a cada uno de nuestros invitados. Entonces, hemos decidido hacerlo en 3 semisesiones, subsesiones. En la primera de ellas hablarán, ahora les vamos a presentar también, Unkel y Eric White, que son los que son conservadores de colecciones. Luego seguirá la siguiente subsesión, yo no sé por qué he decidido llamarlas así, hablarán Giorgos, Boudalis y Brent Nongbri, que son especialistas en libros antiguos, y finalmente, al final hablará Roberta Mazza, que es especialista en el comercio de antigüedades y de papiros en el siglo XX. Entonces vamos a presentarles para que los conozcáis con un poco más de las gafas para leer, porque si no... Jill Unkel es conservadora, Jill Unkel aquí a mi derecha, es conservadora de las colecciones occidentales de la Biblioteca Chester Beatty en Dublín, y por eso es responsable de los papiros y de los manuscritos cristianos y también de los grabados europeos. Su investigación se centra en el estudio de los manuscritos iluminados y la iconografía, la historia del libro y la cultura impresa de la Europa temprana. Ha sido comisaria de múltiples exposiciones en el Museo Chester Beatty, entre ellas Costume Parisien, Wicked Wit y Mystery of Money. Me gustaría haber visto esa última especialmente. Y ha escrito numerosos artículos y capítulos en revistas y libros científicos, de los que debemos destacar... ¡Ay, el micrófono! Perdón. De la que debemos... Sí, es que estoy un poco nerviosa con esto. Debemos destacar en relación con el códice de Ezequiel todo su trabajo en varios artículos sobre la historia de la compra de los papiros bíblicos por parte de Sir Alfred Chester Beatty, de la que nos va a hablar ahora. Eric White es conservador de libros raros de la biblioteca Firestone de la Universidad de Princeton, tras haber sido también conservador de las colecciones especiales de la biblioteca Bridgewell de la Universidad Metodista del sur de Texas. Es especialista en la historia de la imprenta en sus fases más antiguas, ¿no? Y los incunables, y ha publicado numerosos artículos y catálogos en exposiciones en libros raros. Su primer libro, Editio Princeps, que me encanta como título para un libro, Editio Princeps, A History of the Gutenberg Bible, ganó en 2018 el premio de Long de Historia del Libro de la Society for the History of Authorship, Reading and Publishing.
Y seguimos ahora presentando al resto de participantes que están aquí, luego les podrán ver. Al profesor Giorgos Boudalis, que es licenciado en Bellas Artes por la Universidad de Tesalónica y en Conservación de Arte por la Universidad, en Florencia y Atenas. Especializado en la conservación de libros y doctor por la University of the Arts en Londres. Es el director de la sección de conservación del libro en el Museo de Cultura Bizantina de Tesalónica, y se ha especializado en la factura y encuadernación de libros antiguos y medievales, y ha trabajado con manuscritos de los lugares donde puede ir él, el Monte Athos, donde a nosotras no nos dejan, pero el monasterio de Santa Catalina de Sinaí, entre otros muchos monasterios. Es autor de muchas publicaciones académicas, de las que es necesario destacar hoy aquí su libro The Códice and Crafting in Late Antiquity de 2018, y actualmente está terminando un libro sobre encuadernaciones en el Mediterráneo Oriental y que estamos esperando que salga pronto. Brent Nongbri es catedrático del, y esto lo debería leer Sofía porque tampoco sé yo pronunciarlo bien, MF Exacto, porque el noruego no es mi lengua materna, así que mejor. Es especialista en el estudio de la religión, con especial atención al cristianismo primitivo. Actualmente dirige el proyecto de investigación, que lo traduzco al castellano, La historia temprana del códice, una nueva metodología y ética para los estudios de manuscritos, con sus siglas ECI-Codex. Su libro más reciente, porque es autor también de muchísimos artículos y es muy productivo académicamente, el libro más reciente es God's Library, que también es muy buen título para un libro, The Archaeology of the Earliest Christian Manuscripts, que ganó en 2019 el premio de Long Book History Prize, como ya hemos oído de él también, otorgado por la Society for the History of Authorship, así como el premio de la Biblical Archaeology Society al mejor libro sobre un tema del Nuevo Testamento. Y por último, la profesora Roberta Mazza, que es profesora de papirología en el Departamento de Patrimonio Cultural de la Università di Bologna desde 2022. Antes de esto ha trabajado como profesora en la Universidad de Manchester. Su investigación incluye tanto ediciones de papiros como estudios más amplios sobre la historia del Egipto romano y bizantino, pero en los últimos años se ha dedicado intensamente a cuestiones de ética académica en la publicación de manuscritos, la historia colonial de la papirología y el mercado legal e ilegal de papiros y otras antigüedades egipcias. Su libro Stolen Fragments, Black Markets, Bad Faith and the Illicit Trade in Ancient Artifacts, publicado en 2024, ha sido galardonado también con la medalla de plata en la categoría de Historia de los Premios Independientes del Libro en 2025. Así que con este plantel de académicos y conservadores, creo que vamos a poder disfrutar muchísimo de una visión muy panorámica y muy global de todo lo que concierne a un libro como es el Códice de Ezequiel, con gran importancia no solo material, sino también de conservación, sus colecciones y el texto que trae. Así que, sin más, le cedemos la palabra a Jill Unkel.
Okay. Okay. So I thought I would start with a very brief introduction to Chester Beatty, and then we'll look specifically at how the Dublin Leaves were acquired by him. So, American-born, British naturalized, and honorary Irish citizen, the mining engineer financier Alfred Chester Beatty was born in New York in 1875 during the American Gilded Age. He attended university and started his career at a time of rapid industrialization and the increased concentration of wealth among the so-called robber barons. Chester Beatty made his first million working for the Guggenheims, primarily in the American West and Mexico, before he moved to London in 1913 and established Selection Trust, which eventually had interests in diamond mines in Sierra Leone and Ghana, copper in Zambia, formerly Northern Rhodesia, lead, silver and zinc in Russia, Kosovo in Canada, nickel and iron in Australia, and copper and gold in America. Many of those American wealthy magnates, like the Guggenheims, Morgan, Huntington, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, used part of their fortunes to hoover up art and antiquities, as we can see Morgan here, as a form of social clout and ostentatious consumption. Chester Beatty began to collect modestly, with records showing purchases in New York of snuff bottles, Netsuke and Inro, Japanese and Chinese lacquer, Chinese vases, antique weapons, porcelain, rhino horn cups, Chinese jade, Russian icons, European prints, watercolors, and oil paintings, but like a small amount of each of those things. The sudden death of his first wife, Nanette Grace Madeline, in 1911, probably led to his move to London in 1913, where he married the eventual collector and racehorse owner Edith Dunn in June of that year. Oh, there's their London house. Very fancy, Kensington Palace Gardens. So in 1915, early 1916, when the couple met the collector and director of the Fitzwilliam Museum, Sidney Cockerell, Beatty had a collection of about 15 European manuscripts, mostly books of hours. Cockerell encouraged him to continue collecting, but also introduced him to other collectors and collections so that his taste and knowledge would improve. In 1918, Chester and Edith, the rich and exceedingly generous Americans, had recently become known in London, following the lend of their Kensington Palace Gardens house to the American Red Cross and the purchase of Calehill Park in Kent. The Red Cross Hospital was opened by Walter Hines Page, the American ambassador, on the 20th of March, which also made the papers the following day. And numerous photographs appeared in The Gentlewoman, The Sketch, and The Ladies' Field. The purchase of Calehill was noted in no less than 20 newspapers on or after the 23rd of March. In 1919, Morgan's librarian, Belle de Costa Green, wrote to E.H. Dring at Quaritch, "I think Mr. Chester Beatty has a very fine appreciation of manuscripts and will end up being a serious rival to us someday. There is no one over here in America who either knows or even suspects anything about fine manuscripts, and for that reason it is a great pleasure to meet a real connoisseur." Dring replied, "I'm glad you like Mr. Chester Beatty. He really has a very good knowledge of manuscripts and is a real amateur in that line. He adds to his knowledge every day." The first reference to a loan of one of his manuscripts to an exhibition is in 1924. But it seems to be a loan of manuscripts to the Royal Academy's Flemish and Belgian art exhibition in 1927, where he finally made the paper as not just a rich American, but a collector of manuscripts, alongside Gates Thompson and Dyson Perrins. And then other loans from his collection followed throughout the 1930s. This right side? Yes, so in 1929, the Daily News and Westminster Gazette reported that Mrs. Beatty intended to winter in Cairo in the future and take up bracing there. The couple had visited with Beatty's children in 1914, and you can see them there on their camels, and they were both clearly enamored of the country. In February 28, Beatty wrote to the dealer and scholar Abraham Yehuda, "I love this land and always feel at home here." Much later in life, Chester related to his friend Sheila Powerscourt, "This is how I began collecting. When my wife and I took a trip to Egypt, I spent a lot of time in the souks and bought a few papyri that turned out to be important." Which brings us to the biblical papyri and back to January 1930. So the Beattys left for Egypt before the 14th of January 1930, confirmed by a letter from Joan Kingsford Wood, Beatty's librarian at Baroda House, to John W. Corbel, one of Beatty's secretaries at Selection Trust. She wrote, "I'm so glad Mr. Beatty had a nice day for the first part of his trip." They had arrived by the 22nd of January, also confirmed by Joan, when she wrote, "I hope you had a comfortable and easy journey to Cairo and no rough crossings." Joan, incidentally, was Cockerell's sister-in-law, and both her and her sister, Kate Cockerell, were artists. That winter, they stayed at Mena House Hotel, as we can see from some postcards and telegrams sent to Chester Beatty there. And Eric Miller, keeper of manuscripts at the British Museum, who published Beatty's Western manuscripts in 1927, wrote to Beatty on the 2nd of February, "I hope by this time that you are basking in the sun. I know that you have arrived in Egypt because I received 2 papyri from Naaman a day or 2 ago, with a letter saying that you were writing to me. I will write in detail when I get your letter. In the meantime, Harold de Bell and Frederick Kenyon have got them in hand, and you should close the bargain if you haven't done so already, as you have got a couple of winners, both are biblical, and one is of very great textual importance." Naaman is, of course, Maurice Naaman, antiquities dealer based in Cairo. His visitor's book, preserved at the Brooklyn Museum in New York, records signatures from both Edith in 1928 and Chester in 26 and 35. His signature does not appear in the book in 1930, so perhaps Naaman visited him directly at the hotel, but there's no record of this meeting or any invoices confirming any of these purchases. So on the 3rd of February, the day after his first letter, Miller wrote again to John A. Witterson, another secretary at Selection Trust, decoding a cryptic telegram he had sent to Beatty, in which he explains that the two papyrus delivered by Naaman were 13 leaves of a 3rd century manuscript and 21 leaves in 2 columns of a 4th century manuscript. You can see the codes on the screen there. In a follow-up letter on the 10th of February, Miller elaborated, "I sent you a telegram which I hope gave you the information you wanted, and I hope by now that both the mines are your property. Silver mine, which is probably 3rd century and certainly not later, contains the text of Daniel. It is of the greatest importance and interest and is a real find. The gold mine is 4th century, containing the text of Genesis. Bell has not tested any of the readings of this, but it is bound to be worth having, and I hope you have secured it. We asked Edwards to convey the above information to you in Egypt verbally, which is why I have taken a few days before writing. I hope you are enjoying your holiday." In an archive notebook titled Western Manuscripts Recent Acquisitions, kept by Joan Kingsford Wood, is a list of objects brought back by Beatty from Cairo in January to March 1930. He was in Cairo in January, so it presumably purchased throughout that time and brought back in 1930. And you can see a list of 3 tins of papyrus, a Greek manuscript, 1 parcel containing 112 leaves and odd fragments, and a parcel of fragments. I don't know who Charles is. So on the 11th of April, Bell wrote to Beatty, "Miller has handed over the papyri you brought back and asked me to examine them. I can assure you, even on the strength of what I have seen, that you have made a most valuable purchase. The literary papyri and are all biblical or religious, which personally I regret. But their early date gives them a quite special interest and value. And the find most certainly ranks with the most important ever made." I think this, therefore, is probably the rest or most of the rest of the biblical papyrus that will eventually be published as the Chester Beatty Biblical Papyri. Now, you can see I've identified a couple other things that he purchased around this time. We're going to ignore most of them, but you'll forgive me if we just tangent very briefly on one of these Coptic covers. A memorandum from Kingsford Wood on the 12th of May reads, "With reference to the covers I took to the museum, Mr. Bell is very much in favor of buying them. They are very remarkable, and he has never seen anything like them before. And granted that the price is reasonable, he would urge you to get them. One of them is very similar to the pages of the book of Daniel, which you have just bought, and might belong to the same period." You might forgive Bell if he very briefly thought that these 2 objects, which cursory examination look very similar in size, were purchased from the same dealer and at the same time, maybe from the same book. But I think, as we all already know, this is not the full page. And in fact, unless the book was bound doubled over, this is not its cover. In September of that year, Frederick Kenyon sent Beatty a summary of the papyrus he had seen to date. In his introduction, and I've sort of summed it up here for you because his handwriting is actually quite illegible. Numbers 2, 4, 5, 8, and 9, so Genesis, Isaiah, Jeremiah, the Luke, John fragments, and Acts, are not now here. I suppose they are in Hibger's hands for mounting. Numbers 3, 6, and 11, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Daniel, and Revelation, I have transcribed in full in 8 leaves of number 1, or Genesis. The most important from their early date are Numbers 3, 6, and 8, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Daniel, and the Luke, John, and Daniel is especially important. There is no doubt that this is by very much the most important biblical discovery that has been made for very many years. He added, "While I'm in America, I hope I shall be able to ascertain just what they have in Michigan. But it looks as if there might be other portions of the find scattered around the world, and perhaps still in native hands in Egypt." He was correct on both counts. And you will note that this list does not include the Ezekiel Esther bifolios that are in Dublin. Kenyon concluded, "You are very much to be congratulated on your discovery." I think he meant purchase. The Daniel folios were indeed mounted by the German papyrus conservator, Dr. Hugo Ipscher, and then numbered by Kingsford Wood. And she writes in the catalog notebook, "The biblical papyrus were numbered BP or Beatty papyrus 22, etc., by me as they were delivered by Dr. Ipscher, solely to keep a record of the number of glass plates, hence the apparent disorder of the books in the following pages. And then there's a note that's inserted into the notebook that includes the Daniel pages with their BP numbers. And here are all 13 leaves with their assigned BP numbers written on the original sealing tape that was mounted by Ipscher. So in 1933, then there they are again, written in the notebook. We're going to do that. So in 1933, when Kenyon published the first introductory volume of the Chester Beatty Biblical Papyri facsimiles, he summarized the 13 Daniel leaves, noted that 2/5 of the bottom was missing, suggested the original leaf was 14 by 5 inches, that it came from a codex of 96 leaves and dated to not later than the first half of the 3rd century. For the 8 bifolios of Ezekiel and Esther, he estimated the same size from a codex of 78 leaves and dating probably the latter part of the 3rd century. So the same codex took a century to copy. So we turn now back to our missing bifolios, and actually back to July 1930. So among the notes written by Kingsford Wood in a file that contains correspondence with Michigan is a note about 22 leaves in a cupboard in Baroda House that were purchased from Naumann. And they consist of part of them, the Book of Esther, and part of them, Colossians, probably 2nd century. Most important, Mr. Bell does not know of any text so early of these books. He urges you to freeze on them most decidedly. Beatty wrote to Naumann the following day, I beg to confirm our conversation over the telephone with reference to the leaves of Greek papyri and the binding. I am purchasing these from you for a sum of 750 Egyptian pounds. Now, this may be those leaves, but this could also be the many leaves that he purchased from Naumann around the same time, so I'm not quite sure. But as it is the same day, it seems likely that it is the biblical leaves. Another note by Kingsford Wood to Corbel, written on the same day, reads, thank you for this copy of Mr. Beatty's letter to Naumann. I could barely hear the latter this morning. His voice was like a pinprick, but I gather I am to meet him in the museum at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. And I think this sort of just confirms that a lot of information was conveyed in person and over the telephone. So we're missing quite a bit that people just didn't write down. So here are those 22 pages recorded in our acquisitions notebook. By Joan Kingsford Wood, as purchased from Naumann in July 1930, mounted at the British Museum and housed in Safe B. This is a note, I believe, in Ipscher's handwriting of the chapter verses of each of the objects that he mounted. Their reordering, and then the BP numbers written next to him, and are actually our current numbering system. The folio is all glazed, and then of course we can see at the top of each one of them the chapter verses identified and then actually crossed out because they were sort of invertedly identified, and then someone later on realized actually Esther is Ezekiel and Ezekiel is Esther. And then finally we have them here properly written into the catalog. And there's a little note that says, collected from Dr. Gardner on the 8th of April, 1931, to be taken to Frederick Kenyon, which I think then explains why in September 1930, even though these were purchased in July, he had no idea that they existed because they weren't delivered to him until the following year. But this isn't quite the end of our story, even though that's the sum of our leaves. On the 9th of March, 1934, Arthur Jeffries from the School of Oriental Studies in Cairo wrote to Kenyon about 26 leaves of the Chester Beatty Biblical Papyri that he heard about through the underground channels in Cairo. He noted that the owners were asking £100 per leaf and that they dare not go to the market lest the government take them. Jeffrey could not at that time go to Fayoum to investigate, but offered to get in touch with the sellers through Dr. Askren. Edith and Chester were back in Egypt that winter, this time staying at their own house in Mena. You can see the interior courtyard there. It had a lovely view of the pyramids. And so on the 17th and 18th of March, Beatty interviewed the Beni Suef base dealer Shakir Faraj, presumably at that time in Cairo, but potentially down in the Fayum as well. And the interview, as you can see, the kind of summary here, included some interesting details about the find, but not the actual find spot. You'll see the kind of blank bits where it doesn't actually list where or how far away from Cairo or what side of the Nile. I don't know if he knew and didn't write it down or he just wasn't told. But it also includes some very specifics about the pages that were for sale at that time. One were the pages of the New Testament, originally 26 leaves of text, 26 lines of text. And the second was Old Testament leaves on long sheets that had been bent over. These were photographed and had been sent to a bishop in a Greek church who pronounced them 3rd century. They contained portions of the prophets. He had at the time suggested Jeremiah and Isaiah. Beatty saw 15 of the leaves, but noted that there may be more. And the memorandum included, as you can see, some diagrams of the Old Testament leaves and how they might have been bent over. So he also writes, so Beatty writes to Joan Kingsford Wood on the 26th of March, asking him to send her like a full summary of all the biblical papyrus he had, because I may probably buy some more. And you can see that summary there, a little blurry at the bottom. On the 18th of March, so the second day of his interview with the dealer, Beatty writes to his friend, the publisher Wilfred Merton, that he had bought 36 leaves, it's actually 46, of the New Testament epistle, the Pauline epistles. And of the Old Testament pages, he said, "These are the ones that Faraj asks such a foul price for. I have seen 15 of these leaves, and there are some more, but I do not know the exact number. They are from prophets," again suggesting Jeremiah and Isaiah. He noted that negotiations for the Pauline epistles took 3 months and had started as soon as he arrived in Egypt, that he had seen a few photographs of the Old Testament ones, and he was hoping to secure them that summer. Those said photographs are in our archive, if you can see one there. And he asked Merton not to mention this information to anyone because Naumann, if he knows, might block things so that I will lose all chance to get the balance. So obviously Naumann would have liked to have acted as an intermediary, getting his cut, and here Beatty's kind of cut him out. Kenyon wrote to Beatty on the... Hold on. So negotiations continued. I'll go back one more. Almost done. The following winter, but with no progress. Beatty reporting to Kenyon in April 1935. "Unfortunately, it is somewhat impossible to deal with the man who owns them. He has an idea that they are worth far more than the whole of the Testament. I think he is asking about 120 a leaf. However, next year I may be able to get a fair price for them." I think we all know what happened. So Kenyon wrote to Beatty in June of 1936, "I hear an American has got the leaves of the Ezekiel papyrus, of which you secured photographs 2 years ago, and they are now at Princeton." So I just thought I would sort of end with just a summary of sort of what we're doing at the museum. We held a kind of COVID sort of distanced conference in 2021, and the proceedings of that conference were published in 2023. And it's all online. It's open access. So if you want to read any of that, it's absolutely available for anyone. You just sort of Google the Chester Beatty Biblical Papyri at 90 and it pops right up. The publication includes a sort of summary of the whole acquisition of the biblical papyrus. In 2022, 2023, we also held an exhibition called First Fragments at the museum. And the exhibition included a section on collecting an antiquities market. Obviously, you only get about 120 words for the panel, so it wasn't a lot of information, but there's a little more in the catalog and then a reference to the publication. The current plan is we've got a paper coming out on Beatty's acquisition of papyrus from Tano post-World War that I've co-authored with Dan Sharp. And we're going to present the relationship between Beatty, Bodmer, Tano, and Bongard at the SBL in November. And the plan is we've drafted text panels to go into the main galleries that talk about provenance that will be put into the permanent galleries, and also to add a new page to the website that looks a little bit more deeply, but still kind of on a bloggy sort of version on the papyrus acquisitions. Thank you. Do you in a spot? Sure. Otherwise, we have to move.
What, do you just hit this for next?
Yeah. It's like naturally you left it where he takes up. No?
You like that? Yeah. Yeah, let's go to the next one. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's nice to be here from Princeton and to follow this wonderful talk. Thanks to the Fundación Pastor and Sophia and Raquel. It's really nice to be here. This is my second day of entering this field, and it's really nice to have the feeling that anything I say will then pass into very capable hands. So thank you very much. Right. The Scheide Library, housed inside Princeton University's library, Firestone Library, was bequeathed to the university in 2015 by William H. Scheide, the last of 3 generations of book collectors. His grandfather, William T. Scheide, on the left here, had made an enormous fortune in the early days of Pennsylvania oil exploration, serving as John D. Rockefeller's national manager of pipelines for Standard Oil. He retired in 1889 at the age of 42 to enjoy a life of books. Yeah, well, when you're in charge of the pipeline, yeah. He retired at the age of 42 to enjoy a life of books in Titusville, Pennsylvania, collecting mainly American history and travel books. His son, John H. Scheide, was educated at Princeton University, class of 1896. He expanded his late father's library immensely, adding books of world significance. These included Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, such as the Blickling Homilies. I think I have a picture there. Wonderful, circa, the 10th, 11th century manuscript. Significant monuments of early European printing. They had the first copy of Shakespeare's First Folio to come to America. The first printing of the Declaration of Independence from 1776, and an autograph anti-slavery speech by Abraham Lincoln, his first, when he was young. John also purchased a marvelous copy of the Gutenberg Bible in 1924, as one does. John's son, William, known as Bill, also graduated from Princeton, the class of 1936, and this is really our time period. Bill likewise expanded the intellectual breadth of the family library, particularly in the history of early printing. But his greatest legacy as a collector was in the field of Baroque and classical music manuscripts. He was a fine musician, a musicologist, and a founder of the Bach Aria Society. His autographed musical manuscripts include 2 cantatas of J.S. Bach, a piano sonata by Mozart, and 2 sketchbooks by Beethoven. His philanthropy extended well beyond giving the books to a university. He also funded important civil rights litigation, provided scholarships for students, and donated his prized possession, the famous Bach portrait, to the city of Leipzig. This is the widow, Judy Scheide, at the ceremony in Leipzig when Bach came home. John Scheide had a deep interest in the history of the Bible and the transmission of its text in manuscripts and printed editions. Now, on June 15th, 1935, some months after what we were just talking about, he hosted Dr. Edmund Cayce Jr., who's in this image, who had earned his doctorate in classics at Princeton in 1933 and then taught New Testament Greek at the local theological seminary. He hosted Dr. Cayce at his home in Titusville to see some rare books. Professor Cayce must have mentioned Greek papyri because that evening he wrote to his host, who must have been very interested. He wrote to him that he would introduce him to Professor Alan C. Johnson, also in this picture, from Princeton's classics department, adding, I am certain that he will be able to put you in touch with those who are offering the remaining Beatty papyri. So that's how they were identified first, the Beatty papyri, but there are more of them. Already in July or early August 1935, Scheide was corresponding with Professor Johnson, who must have been contemplating the potential purchase of the mysterious group of papyri in Egypt, but needed to find someone who could help fund the endeavor. On August 16th, Johnson sent Scheide a letter in which he reported that the unseen manuscript was evidently biblical and had nearly double the number of lines per page as the Beatty fragments. Here's Johnson's letter of 1935, mentioning these treasures for the first time. And what I can see here is John Scheide saying, "Oh, we should do this for Princeton." Enclosed with Johnson's letter was a typed copy of a letter of July 27th, 1935, from Dr. David Leslie Askren, former Presbyterian medical missionary in Fayoum, who had seen 5 sample leaves in the hands of an antiques dealer in Beni Suef. Throughout the 1920s, Askren's patients, who were local farmers, had discovered papyri on their land, and through these connections, he had played a central role in Professor Kelsey's acquisitions for the University of Michigan. Askren's letter described the manuscripts as 20 sheets, each 35 by 11 centimeters. So we know that these are these tall ones, written on both sides in a beautiful literary hand, varying from 52 to 56 lines to a side, and all were letter perfect, except for one which had 2 erasures. Askren reported that Madame Medea Norsa, conservator of papyrus collections at the University of Florence, had tried to purchase these remaining leaves for the Vatican Library, but she was rebuffed from above. The Vatican's librarians feared that the manuscript was being offered in parcels to different parties to force up the price. They wanted the entire manuscript or no manuscript at all. Askren boasted that although the dealer in Beni Suef wanted $1,000 per leaf, he got the agent to agree to only $750 per leaf. Askren's fee for brokering the acquisition would be $1,000. Now, what follows is my summary of the contents of 2 documents that are at Princeton, 2 accounts of the events that would unfold next, one written by Professor Johnson and one written by Professor Kayes. Clearly, and they're both written, by the way, on the stationery of the Italian ocean liners registry. Clearly, by mid-August 1935, Professor Johnson had been discussing the possibility of John Scheide funding the purchase of the leaves, as well as underwriting the expedition to Egypt to obtain them. On August 20, Professors Johnson and Kayes sailed from New York to Naples aboard the SS Rex, this Italian registry boat that was at that time the fastest ship across the Atlantic. From Naples, they took the SS Esperia to Alexandria, arriving on September 10th, and took the night train to Cairo. In the morning, they met Dr. Askren. And here, I'm sorry, my caption says Cairo. This should be Fayoum. This is in his town, at his residence and office. The file is full of little photographs, and so we've got Askren, we've got the office, we've got the various buildings that they're visiting during their trip to Egypt. Already when they arrived, Dr. Askren had outlined a plan for the next day's journey to Fayoum and onward, and the arrangements for the purchase. It was all done. This caused major concern for the American professors. They did not think that the price, even a reduced price, should have been negotiated without them. They were the buyers, especially since they had never seen these papyri. The next morning, Johnson, Kayes, and Askren departed Cairo in Askren's car, seen here, for Beni Suef. The journey featured a long delay at a railroad crossing. I'm just going to show pictures. here is the long delay at the railroad crossing, and you can see the canal is there, the bridge, the cars, Dr. Johnson and Dr. Askren. Okay. And there, they finally did get to Benny Swift, and there they met the what they called a Copt, from whom that they described as a grain merchant, but also a clandestine antiques dealer. That was Shakir Faraj El Asyuti. And there he is. This is a photograph of him at lunch when they just arrived that day. Johnson on the left, Askren on the right, and the selling agent in the middle. Askren was serving as the interpreter. I think all the conversation went through him. Then after this, they went into Shakir Faraj's home. I believe, there they are again. Yeah, here's a shot of Shakir Faraj's home. He should be in the upper story of the building on the left. And here is the Askren's car again, and the gate. I just wanted to show these. I think it's nice that they exist. Nice that they exist. And they went upstairs and were shown 5 of the papyrus leaves. The professors marveled at the manuscript's fine condition, and it did not immediately know what they were looking at. They read Greek, of course, but they didn't know exactly what they're looking at. Quickly used a Septuagint concordance to ascertain which passages they were looking at, that it was from the book of the prophet Ezekiel. They also noted quickly many interesting variant readings, so they became excited, more excited than some. Soon Shakir Faraj showed them 15 additional leaves. And clearly this was an extremely important early manuscript for them, and the finest they had ever seen. But at the same time, the 2 professors were deeply disappointed when they learned that it was not from the New Testament. They had come across the ocean for the Gospels, or the New Testament. What they found was the most beautiful manuscript that they had seen. It happened to be of Ezekiel. And Johnson saw this disappointment as an opportunity to negotiate the price again. Now, to this point, Shakir Faraj had considered the price settled, $750 or 150 pounds per leaf. So I think there was a markup in the intervening weeks. So had Askren. He had set the price, helped set the price at $750, and he strongly advised against any bargaining. But now Johnson, seeing what he had seen, offered only 80 pounds per leaf. Shakir Faraj became very agitated. He suggested, well, then maybe they should only take as many as they could afford, but at his original price, which was the 150, almost double. Sensing a breakdown of goodwill, Askren advised the professors to return with him to Fayum to think it over overnight. And it was agreed that if they wanted the leaves, they would return to Shakir Faraj's place by 1 p.m. the following day. They knew they would be back, but Shakir Faraj did not know that they would be back. Overnight, Johnson and Case agreed that they would return and make an offer of 110 pounds per leaf. It's about $550 to them, assuming that Shakir Faraj would counter that with a higher amount. Between themselves also, they noted that Askren's constant aversion to negotiating, it led them to suspect that he had a stake in the price, a cut from Shakir Faraj. So if so, he was both a seller and an agent for the buyer. They also had a real fear that it would be impossible to bring the price down, and worse, they feared returning to Princeton with nothing. So on Thursday morning, the 3 of them returned to Beni Suef. The professors waited in the car while the increasingly pessimistic Askren negotiated with Shakir Faraj inside. Very quickly, he came outside and said they needed to proceed to the bank. Shakir Faraj had refused their offer of 110 pounds. And at that point, Askren had laid down the final take it or leave it price of 120 pounds, but without consulting the buyers. Anyway, Shakir Faraj accepted this price, the equivalent to $600. There was considerable trouble drawing 2,400 pounds from the local bank in the late afternoon, but soon this amount was paid, the papyri were handed over, and the gentlemen shook hands and parted ways. Thus, the Scheide papyri were purchased 90 years ago today, on September 12th, 1935. Well done. Yeah. The professors then set sail for Alexandria on September 14th aboard the Asperia. I like boats. I have a picture of the Asperia in possession of one of the greatest manuscripts ever to sail from Egypt to America. Both ships, the Rex that they came over on and the Asperia, were destroyed in World War II. And these are sort of the last pictures of these boats that carried the Princeton papyri. And strangely, in all of these early sources that I've discussed, they were talking about 20 leaves. First they were shown 5, then they were shown 15, and they paid for 20 leaves. Yet there are 21 Ezekiel leaves in the Scheide Library. Shakir Faraj must have miscounted and didn't know that he sold 21 for the price of 20. By September 29th, 1935, Johnson and Case had reached Princeton. Young Bill Scheide, entering his 4th year of college, met with them in Princeton, and he saw the papyri, which were in the library and were being mounted between glass plates for the first time. He wrote to his father with a report of his discussions with the professors, including some key details not reported in their longer written accounts. Most interesting, perhaps, is that Askren seemed to know something about the origins of the leaves, as well as others, saying that they came from Shakir Faraj's home village, Mir, 50 or 60 miles north of Asyut. In a subsequent letter, Bill told his father that, quote, Professor Johnson also quoted Askren to the effect that it is likely that all the Beatty and Michigan and Scheide stuff was found together in a single grave in a Coptic priest, of a Coptic priest in Mir. When Professors Johnson, Case, and Henry Gaiman, a professor of Old Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary, published the John H. Scheide Biblical Papyri, Ezekiel, in Princeton University Press volume in 1938, they uttered not a single word about the provenance, other than to consider whether it came from a grave or not. The son also told the father in his letters, quote, Case thinks undoubtedly that you have gotten one of the best manuscripts, at least, if not the very best one, that ever came out of Egypt. He continued, in getting it out, they were singularly fortunate in getting their baggage aboard in the evening when the regular customs force was off duty. Professor Johnson, he continued, had the papyri inside a dirty shirt, which with other laundry was in a little tray occupying the top of one of the suitcases. As the inspectors came to see the bag, Johnson courteously lifted up the little tray so that they could poke around in the suitcase below, which the inspector did. They said what they were really looking for was the gold, which the Italians were trying to take. Some treasures are far more valuable than gold. The John H. Scheide Biblical Papyri were given to Princeton University Library outright in 1935. That is, there's Mir. They were given to the library in 1935, 80 years before the Scheide Library itself went to Princeton. They were meant to be, and there's the 1938 volume, excuse me. They were meant to be seen by students and scholars who were invited to use them. Johnson, Case, and Gaiman published this well-received study of the papyri in 1938, illustrated with 42 useful plates and the study of the text. And the leaves continue to be available to scholars around the world. Of course, they've been digitized. And of course, they were shared digitally with the current exhibition at the Biblioteca Nacional. And I have the pleasure of sharing them with students in our classrooms and in scholarly gatherings of other kinds, such as this event last year, when all 21 were brought out for a lecture by Dr. Sofia Torres Tovar. And that was a fun day, wasn't it? Yes, yeah. I will end with 3 quotations by Professors Johnson, Gaiman, and Kayes, which they inscribed in John Scheide's copy of their study of the Ezekiel Papyri in 1938. Here are the inscriptions. Alan C. Johnson quoted Ezekiel 20, verse 10, "Lo, I caused them to go forth out of the land of Egypt." Henry Gaiman wrote of, he quoted Ezekiel 2, 9, and 10, "And lo, a roll of the book was therein, and spread it before me, and it was written within and without." And then Edmund Kayes, with whom we began, quoted Ezekiel 37, verse 2, "And lo, they were very dry." Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So let's continue. Thank you so much for your panel. Let's continue. Dejamos ahora hablando de materialidad, entonces invito a Giorgos Boudalis y a Brent Nongbri, que entonces van a hablar del libro como libro.
Okay, thank you, Sofia and Raquel, and thank you for the invitation and for hosting us. Thank you to the colleagues. I will be speaking about the making of books in late antiquity and how books at that time are depicted in art. So I will be showing you images of art of the time and some reconstructions of books. Thank you. And why late antiquity is so important? Late antiquity is so important for the history of the book because it is the time when we have this major transition from the roll to the codex. This is just like to refresh our idea. So at the time, late antiquity, we basically have 4 major book forms and maybe more informal, of which we know close to nothing. So we obviously have the papyrus roll, we have the tablet codices, often wax tablet codices, we have the single quire codex and the multi-quire codex, right? And these are all replicas here, replicas that I've done through the years, but they give you an idea, a sense, a visual sense of what a book collection at the time would look like. And as I said, probably at the time there must have been other forms of the book, simpler and more and less accomplished maybe, of which we know very little. And there is a very interesting literary evidence in this sense about 3 sisters from Thessaloniki, Agapi, Irini, and Chioni, not Chine, dated that in 304 of the Common Era, they were found to possess Christian books of different forms, so parchments, books, wooden tablets, codices, and pages. So written texts, or rather Christian texts written in 4 different formats of books of somehow. So, I mean, the idea of book at the time must have been a rather broad series of formats of some sort. Yeah, I mean, and this is, I think, a very quite telling image, basically telling us that despite the hundreds of years past, some concepts and practical uses of books have pretty much remained unchanged. And this is maybe because some of the very basic forms of the codex, and so basically the bifolio, which is, I think, the building block almost of a codex, have remained, have remained unchanged, obviously, but they are by their very nature, they are self-sufficient and almost complete. So take the idea of, so I've got here some samples, you can play with this later. So this is a wax tablet codex from the early ages of centuries of late antiquity. You can write, you can use it, but once you close it, it's a very safe thing to keep. And that's the idea of a bifolio, right? And that you can see it, from biological, from the world of biology to the world of high technology, it still remains the same. The idea, I mean, just to stress the idea that the principle of the codex is a very important one and very complete in a way. That's why it hasn't really changed for all these years. So let's say a few words about these different ideas, the different forms of the codex. Obviously, tablet codices are the earliest form of the codex that we have. This is the earliest example, physical example preserved. It is 14th century BCE from a shipwreck in off the coast of Turkey. We have several wax tablet codices from Roman times and especially from late antiquity. The specific one comes from 4th century or early 5th century, is now at the Louvre, and it was the notebook of a student called Papnution, right? And this is the same codex closed. What I want you to notice, because we will say a few more things about it, are those lines, incised lines at the spine, and the holes through which the tablets were held together. And again, you have, well, in a way, plenty of images showing people using books already from antiquity. And these are obviously two images from Attic pottery from the 5th century, showing people using tablet codices. I also want you to look at that image top there. That's a tablet codex as well, only that it's not open, but it is wrapped. And in fact, that scene is a scene from a school, right? So there are teachers and students. But you get images from tablet codices being used now that in different contexts. This is an administrative context, so it is a consular diptych from around 400 CE. Look at the wax tablet codices held by these two people, and look also to those small squares, right? It is the exact same squares you find here, and they were there in order to prevent the sticky surface of the wax to stick together. So I'm saying all that in order to stress that some of these images are really very accurate representations of the book and therefore can be potentially very useful. Yeah, look at that image. We will come back to that image later. This is another image from Roman art from the 1st century of the Common Era, Plutei Traiani, showing people of the time burning documents, financial documents, written on tablet codices. We don't really know exactly if they were waxed or just whitewashed or what, but look at how big they could be as opposed to the small tablet codices we've just seen before. So again, tablet codices, we have the impression that they were, stiff and not, in our understanding, not very practical, but they in fact were very practical, and they could be used from, everyday common use from everyday people to administrative purposes. In fact, this is an everyday scene. A funerary relief from Rome showing a butcher's shop and the wife of the butcher taking notes, registering probably economical issues on a wax tablet codex. Calliope, the muse of epic and heroic poetry, commonly represented holding a tablet codex, a small one, like this one, which in Latin was called pugillares because it was possible to hold in your palm. And of course, the famous wall paintings from Pompeii. To the left, the husband and wife from Pompeii. He was, I think, a baker. Don't remember his name, but it's interesting. He's holding a papyrus roll with a syllabus, the small red tag. And his wife was holding an open tablet codex. And of course, to the right, the famous so-called Sappho portrait with, again, a tablet and a stylus. Again, we will come back to this image later. This is another student's wax tablet codex from 6th century, now in the Louvre, obviously, found in Egypt now in the Louvre. In the small photograph, it's the actual physical codex. In the drawing is the stack of the different tablets. Again, notice the holes and notice those recesses at the spine of the tablets. This is the same codex with a possible reconstruction of how these tablets might have been connected together. In the small inset photograph, that one is basically the same technique used to work mats, and it's called a binding. And this brings the idea that you cannot really reconstruct the history of the codex unless you see it within the context, the general context of the material culture of the time, right? This is an artifact made in a society who was making other artifacts, okay? That is a general principle of what it means to try and reconstruct the any artifact, in our case, the codex. These are the front and back tablets of the Papnutian codex that we've seen before, so a student's codex. I want you to notice these areas here and those areas here. Those areas, because of the way the wood is consumed, they really tell us where the thread connecting these boards was to be found. And that's very important because it really gives us a very important hint as to propose ways in which these tablets could be connected or bound together. And these are four completely hypothetical ways, right? From very simple ones like this one to rather complicated ones like the one to the right. Hypothetical, but then here is where iconographical evidence becomes very important. This is a relief, late 2nd century AD, showing it's a scene of people collecting taxes, if I'm correct. So you see money on the table, but you also see a tablet codex, obviously for recording transactions. These are thanks to Brent, really, who identified that. What we see there is a tablet codex, or probably wax tablet codex, but look at the spine, look at this thing. Now, the only thing that can be is probably a representation of the way these tablets were connected together. That's important, very important, really, for our discussion here. And this is a reconstruction of one of these student tablets now in the Louvre. They give you an idea of how they could be opened and closed and what one would see at the spine. Now, this is the small tablet codex. These are exact replicas of actual tablets found in archaeological sites, mostly for this time. I mean, because these are late Roman ones. They all come from Pompeii and Herculaneum. And this more complex one is this one. Again, very, technically speaking and functionally speaking, very, very effective, in fact. This is the same codex that I've shown you here, the physical one. This is a representation from a well-known wall painting from Pompeii. It is basically the exact same thing, right? Every detail is pretty well recorded. Look at this. So even the thread that connects the tablets is pretty well shown. So basically, we have two types of showing for keeping together these either tablets or leaves of these early codices. The first one is showing through the whole of thickness. So you have a number of leaves, and you pass your thread through the whole thickness, right? That is a very effective way to keep together the leaves, but it has, and this is an example from the 3rd century. You can see the holes there, right? The only defect that this method has is that once you open the folios, you have to crease, to push your leaf here. So you would have expected that in original findings like this one, you would have expected there to find a crease, especially in papyrus, obviously, because papyrus being much more fragile, you would have expected either to be broken or at least you have a crease there. And we don't normally find
The ghost of Ezekiel.
I think it's okay now? No.
Yeah.
Yes, you can hear me? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So we don't find that crease normally. And this is something we've discussed before with Brent, and we were both puzzled. Why? How is that possible? And the other day, preparing my traveling codex kit for, for the Madrid expedition, I just realized you can do that. You can have that, like this one, right? Only that you have to make such a loop very loose. So you can have it completely open, and you can have it once open, have these stitches there. Now, remember that image, right? Because we will see that. Anyway, so that's one way to do the job. and this is one of the Bodmer papyri, very interesting because it has two different ways of holes. It has those holes, which are really these holes you would have expected, but then it has also those holes which are in the spine fold. And that brings us to the second way of sewing those leaves, which is sewing through the spine fold, right? So you have your book, and you stitch them through here. So the book opens really 180% with no trouble, okay? And this is a diagram of one of the famous Nag Hammadi codices, which are shown through the fold. I think you will say a few more things, right, later on about the specific Ezekiel codex. So we have the single quire codices, obviously a number of leaves stuck together, folded, and then stitched through the fold. This is again the Bodmer papyri, one of the Bodmer papyri. This is a reconstruction of the Nag Hammadi, one of the Nag Hammadi codices, 4th century of the Common Era. Just look that there are these we call them stays, these parchment pieces that really make they really prevent the papyrus to be torn in the process of sewing, right? You don't find them normally in parchment because parchment is a different material, much more strong and much more resistant. So in a very, very, very simplistic way, so my understanding from the available evidence, and that's very important, from available evidence, it seems that the multi-quire codex, so the more complex form of the codex, is a combination, is a hybrid that comes out from the combination of technical features of the wax tablet codex and the single gathering codex. And that, it seems, they produce the multi-gathering codex. So a number of gatherings stuck together and sewn together with some, in some way. And that's a diagram that gives you an idea of that. Now that some way is an interesting, okay, this is a much later codex. It's a Byzantine codex, but the technique with which it is shown, it is actually the same technique with which codices in late antiquity were put together. And that's an interesting fact because it is a technique that has remained unchanged until the 17th century, at least in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, right? It was changed much earlier in the Western world. Anyway, the technique with which gatherings of codices in late antiquity were stitched together is that one, right? And in technical terms, it is a looping technique, all right? So you have a thread which is looped around itself. To our modern eyes, it looks like knitting, right? It's not knitting, it is the ancestor of the technique of knitting. It's called cross-knit looping, okay? And in the time the codex was taking hold in the Mediterranean, the cross-knit looping technique was used to make dress garments, mostly socks, at least from the evidence we have from the sons of Egypt, right? And that again brings back this very interesting understanding or idea that the codex, besides being an intellectual repository, it is a material object, right? And therefore it is made with techniques which travel between different objects, different crafts, okay? And also here comes again the idea of how books were represented in art of late antiquity. And of course, one of the interesting areas to look for that evidence is Christian art, early Christian art. And this is early 5th century sarcophagus from France. Christ is holding a roll at the time, which is something that changes very quickly afterwards. And Christ is represented holding a codex of some form. And there are plenty of such evidence from that period, so 4th, 5th century, with people, well, not just Christ, but people holding codices, open books. Some of these open books, these both examples come from Ravenna. You don't only have the representation, the abstract representation of a book, but again, you have the representation of the stitches, right? Now, the idea that someone would take the pain and the time to carve on stone those single threads that would connect the leaves. I think it's quite telling somehow. And these are images we've seen before, but putting them here in order to exactly stress that despite the very small dimensions of these representations, whoever did that thought it would be important to introduce or to represent the stitching of the codices. These are mosaics from San Vittore in Ciel d'Oro in Milan from 5th century. Again, those stitches. And this is Santa Sabina in Rome, which I quite like, because I recently realized that, I mean, these are the personifications of the church of the Christians and the church of the Jews. One of the two books, which is the book held by the personification of the Christian church, has got the stitches. And the other book, which is the personification of the church of the Jews, has no stitches. I don't know if that says something, but nevertheless, it is, you know, it is something I just noticed, and I thought it's interesting. This is Tribute Justo Catacomb from Rome, 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era. Again, look at those holes there, without the thread this time. But this has been repaired, so it has been conserved. So there is some reconstruction there. I don't know how much of that is reconstructed. And again, two images from the art of late antiquity, showing books wrapped around with fastening straps, and two images from actual books of the time, 4th century Nag Hammadi codices. So you can actually see how closely the two things match one the other. Just notice this codex one here, how closely it resembles the Ezekiel codex as a format. It is basically almost the exact same. And almost finishing, again, two images, Ravenna, famous mosaic from Ravenna, another less famous image, tiny image from a papyrus from 400 about 400 CE, and to the left and right, two reconstructions of two important early codices. The one to the right is the famous Glaser Codex, now in the Morgan Library, preserved almost intact. This is a reconstruction, but very faithful to the original book. And to the left, it's the so-called Al-Mudil Psalter, which is in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. This is a reconstruction made by Julia Miller in an article dedicated to this specific codex. So this idea of the strap, actually two straps wrapped around the codex vertically and horizontally, creating this shape of the cross on the book. And look how faithfully they are represented in the art of the time. And I'm finishing with this last feature, which in a way I find interesting, maybe a bit far-fetched as a hypothesis, but nevertheless, you get images like these ones. This is a papyrus roll, and this is a tablet codex. Look, this thing extending here, and the same thing extending from the Sappho Codex. The same thing there, that's a wall painting from the theater of Nemi, just outside Rome. And the same, that one is a sarcophagus now in the Archaeological Museum of Istanbul. They all show this strap extending from the spine of tablet codices. And we're pretty sure for various reasons, there is no time to, and no point really going into detail, but that strap is somehow the cover of a stylus holder. So a holder which was attached to the wax tablet codex and which would be used as a writing implement for writing on the wax. So this is what I did, which I normally do. So I try to reconstruct this hypothetical thing. Important to say that we have no archaeological evidence of such a thing, which in itself is a very interesting thing, because we have hundreds of styluses, but we have nothing like the original or a fragment even of that. One possibility is that the evidence is there, but it has not been identified, right? Okay. Anyway, this is my interpretation. It works, you know, it's functional. But most importantly, I consider that to be the idea behind one of the strangest features of these early codices, like the Glaser Codex, This is the actual photograph of the original one in the Morgan. This is a reconstruction. Of course, that leather and the spine would have been pasted, which is not in this case in order for people to understand the structure. There is this strange extension at the head of the codex, which we don't really know why it was there. I mean, it seems to have no practical use. That's one thing. And the second thing was that people have always been wondering if there was a similar extension at the bottom. Because there might be an original one there which has been torn away. Okay, so that's a hypothesis. But then recently I came across this fragment, which is the fragment from the spine of a codex. It is preserved in the collection in Germany, and it has been identified wrongly as a belt fragment, but it's definitely the spine of a codex. And again, it is a fragment which has the extension only at the head and not at the tail. So we really, I think, there is good ground to believe that that extension was found only at the head. It doesn't seem to have any practical use, but according to what I've shown you before, it might be a remnant of this extension from a holder, a stylus holder used on tablet codices. I'm not saying I'm right, or I'm not saying I'm wrong. I'm just saying that iconographical evidence is sometimes, if not the only way, a very good way to try and solve some of these puzzles. Yeah, and this is what basically my research tries to do: combine physical evidence, iconographical evidence, and see how they can be put together and make sense. Muchas gracias.
Scoot over here so you can see the images. So thanks so much for organizing this and for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here talking to all of you. So basically what I've done is I asked Sophia and Raquel to have access to the images and just to try to think through different aspects of the materiality of this codex. So that's what I'll be talking about today, construction, script, and just a little bit about the use of this book. So the basic statistics, the height of the page, 34.4 centimeters. The width of the page, about 12.8, maybe 13 centimeters. 59 bifolia, that is 118 folia, 236 pages. Arranged in a single quire. And estimated thickness, maybe about 3 centimeters thick. These are all estimates. We just saw some models by Julia Miller, and she gave me some words of wisdom once, which is that all measurements are estimates. And I like that. So for the thickness here, I tried a couple of different methods. When I've had the opportunity, I've been measuring the thickness of ancient papyri. But of course, that's not something I'm able to do at every collection because the things need to be out of the glass, which is not always the case. But when I've done that, I have a sense of the thickness of a sort of average piece of ancient papyrus. And so multiply that times the number of folia. And then also making models is helpful. And so for this codex, this is actually the Chester Beatty Pauline Epistles Codex that is shown here in the model. We're looking at somewhere between about 2.75 centimeters and 4 centimeters, depending on how compressed the codex was. And you can also see the problem here about the width with a single quire codex. The folia nearest to the center of the codex are actually shorter than the folia on the outside. So when we're talking about these measurements, it's always estimates. I'm giving you for the width here the maximal width that I found. So what about comparanda for codices of this format? There's nothing that I've found that's quite the same in terms of both being so tall and so narrow. The closest pieces would be probably this Papyrus of Oxyrhynchus that is incompletely preserved, but it's a known text. It's Xenophon, so we can estimate what the height of that would have been, and it approaches the height of this Ezekiel codex. And then, interestingly, the other two pieces are magical codices that are also sort of tall and narrow in this way. But you can also see some differences in terms of the layout. Looking at the density of the script there, the Ezekiel codex is a little more open, whereas especially the Xenophon, very compact. Oh, I should also say this is going to be a recurring theme in the talk. The images are not to scale. They're my best effort at getting things to scale, but not every digital image of a papyrus has a scale, which is the bane of my existence. So what about the binding? We saw this image already in Jill's presentation of this memorandum that Chester Beatty had produced that has this nice drawing of one of the leaves of this codex, and there's actually an indication of holes in the margin for the binding cord there. And so my working hypothesis was that this was some sort of stab binding. But yeah, for the first time actually working really closely through the photographs, I'm not quite sure about that. So you can see some of these holes in the margin, and they have the fibers pushed apart. So it's a puncture hole that something's gone through there, pushed the fibers apart. So it's not a wormhole or anything like that. But the interesting thing is, if you go back and rebuild digitally the bifolium, and then look for where the central fold was, I think actually some of these things that look like holes in the margin were actually holes in the center fold, and the break is just uneven along the center fold. So we can see a lower hole here that shows the same kind of displacement of the fibers. It's on both sides there. So I think we've got a kind of stitching that's going through the center fold, but I'm not exactly sure how or in what pattern, because it doesn't really look like two tackets, which is sort of what I would first expect based on the parallels that we saw in Giorgos's paper. So again, here, just an illustration of, as you go through these different bifolia, you can start to see these holes are essentially in the same place in all of them. So that seems to be the case. And maybe there was also one in this more broken area that it's difficult to tell, because that's close to where it was folded in half, it seems like. And then in a couple of the cone pictures, there's the remains of thread. So these images are at different levels of magnification. That thread is actually about the same thickness in each of those. So yeah, I'd have to have a closer look at that to see if there's any other clues about what might be going on. Another problem here is that this codex seems to have been trimmed with scissors at some point, probably on the antiquities market, to make it look nice and neat. And so here I think there's been a cut that is not along the central fold, again creating the image of holes in the margin, when in fact I think these are probably in the central fold. So another thing that I tried to look at was the sort of prehistory of the codex. So papyrus rolls were made by putting together sheets called kolemata. They were pasted together, in the little area of overlap where they're joined is a colesis. And then codices, papyrus codices, were produced by taking one of these rolls and cutting them. So it's not that case that papyrus sheets were made specifically for bifolia for codices. They were cut from these rolls, and we know this because we see these joins in the bifolia of codices. So when a codex is really well preserved, you can recreate the roll from which it was cut. So this is a really nice example from Tura, and you can see the coleces, the joins between the different kolemata really clearly because of the color change in the kolemata. So this is a good example of that, but there's another phenomenon that happens sometimes, which is when we move into the 4th century or so, we start to get these really broad kolema. So this is the Codex of Menander at the Bodmer collection. And you can see, I think, the stripes here going all the way across, and there's no codices, there's no breaks. So at a certain point, codices were made from rolls that were produced with these really long sheets. So trying to do this with the the Ezekiel Codex was tricky because of the different conditions of photography. So not all of them had scales. They're taken at different resolutions. And so trying to match up fibers is tricky. So you can see that there's kind of irregular pattern here. And so the likelihood is that I missed a couple of these. But even this is interesting because it shows that we're not working with something like what we saw with the Bodmer Menander. And that is, these are much smaller kolemata. So that's an interesting data point. This is just an example of trying to do this with lower resolution images with different coloration. It's tricky. So this is an image from the Chester Beatty collection that preserves a number of these bifolia intact, which is very nice. So here we're looking at the Ezekiel script right next to the Daniel Esther script, and you can see just by looking at them from a distance that they're quite distinct. And when we look up close at a couple of letters, so C and alpha, you can see the different formations, the 2 strokes here, as opposed to just 1 stroke, no lift of the stylus. The alpha in the Ezekiel is very interesting, an almost vertical line here that's not something you see very frequently, as opposed to, again, just a single stroke for the alpha in most cases in the Daniel Esther script. One of the interesting things about this, the Daniel Esther script, is the inconsistency in the letter formation. There's a few examples here. The mu, which most often is written in, again, with a single movement of the pen without lifting the stylus. But then here we've got almost like a biblical majuscule kind of mu. Same thing with the upsilon. You've got the single stroke variety, but then this, again, something that looks like a biblical majuscule. Alpha that we've already seen, but then sometimes this sort of pointed alpha with a second stroke. And then the C, most of the time written in 1 stroke, but occasionally the 2 stroke. So when the hand is that inconsistent, it becomes very difficult to find parallels, because if you were only looking at, if you just had before you this mu and this one, you would not say these are from the same manuscript or from the same hand. Same thing with this alpha and this alpha. So comparative evidence then becomes a matter of just sort of a general impression. And so this was one of the pieces that that Eric Turner suggested was a useful comparandum from the archive of Aurelius Isidorus. And this is from 298 CE, so a little bit later than the typical dates that we've seen for this codex of Wilken said 2nd century, Kenyon said 3rd century. The literature sometimes says circa 200. But probably if we keep a wider window of around the 3rd century, we're probably safe. But this is one of the problems of paleography, which is also very much an art of estimation. So about the use of the codex. There's some interesting cursive notes on a few of the leaves that seem to give some indication of sort of marking important passages. So here, Johnson read this as Anastasios. I really can't bring myself to see that last bit as a sigma with that kind of downward back stroke there, but I'll take his word for it. And he read this as probably a reference to Ezekiel 37, the Valley of the Dry Bones, which begins on this page. And it's interesting that in this codex, that chapter is displaced from where it is in most copies of Ezekiel. And so I wonder if this is a kind of like marker of that no, it's actually in this section. And then there are these little curious things that are referred to as reading marks, these diagonal lines that occur throughout the codex. And there's no real rhyme or reason that has been found for what these are marking. They're not really sense units. It's a puzzle. But similar marks occur in the Chester Beatty Pauline Epistles Codex, and they're in a slightly different ink. So this is not the copyist of the codex that's doing this, or if it is, they're doing it at a later point. And it doesn't seem to be the same hand that has done this. These are short ticks in the Beatty Pauline Epistles Codex, but they're more long lines in the Ezekiel Daniel Esther Codex. But it's interesting that they're both occurring within this collection, because this is not something you see in every literary manuscript. So I'll just I'll end here with a couple observations about working through these images that I found interesting. So one thing is, I wonder if as a discipline, we might sort of come up with some standard protocol for digital images, so that we have something, a sort of baseline for comparison in situations like these, where we have the same manuscript spread out among different collections. So I favor white background, centimeter scale, and a color palette. So Barcelona wins. But yeah, I think that if we kind of have that conversation across all collections, that may be a good thing. And then I'm sorry there's no one here from the Cologne collection, because some of these images are a real puzzle to me. So so on this page, this piece seems to be mounted together with modern papyrus with a thread running through it. I'm just wondering what's happening.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah, so if that's an illustration of how they think the binding worked, I'm not sure. I haven't visited these pieces in person. And then this one was quite interesting. Pages 128 and 125 in the shared folder seem to have been placed together. Like if you put the photos together in Photoshop, it looks like page 125 is kind of sitting on top of the very edge of page 128, and that's not the way that they were presented in the old images online. So I wonder if these have been remounted or what's going on there. Because at first I thought, okay, this is a bifolium, which then didn't work with my the rest of the reconstruction that I had been doing, and then I got really worried and puzzled, and I still am, because that can't be a bifolium, I don't think, because the page 128 has vertical fibers and page 125 has horizontal fibers. So I'm very curious about what's happening here. That's very, very curious to me. So I hope I've given us some things to talk about, raise some questions, and thank you again for your attention.
So, I suppose I will have just to do this. Yeah, okay, right? Okay, first of all, thank you for this incredible opportunity to learn a lot about this object that I'm afraid I didn't know that well, and also for the rich papers that you all have given to me. So I will keep it short, quick, but also I think that the most useful thing from my point of view would be, to open a conversation. So that's the aim that I have here. So in my intervention, I would like to provide some comments on the provenance of the codex, its dismembering and present locations or dispersal, if you will, its state of conservation, and finally, I would like to pose questions about its future. Before doing this, I'd like to provide a quick outline of the history of papyrology and papyrus collecting in the context of Egyptian antiquities legislation at the time when the codex surfaced from the market. Of course, it is impossible somehow to discuss the topics I'm dealing with without recalling the wider historical context in which this story took place, a context in which the Egyptians, the people living in Egypt, were struggling for their independence from both the Ottoman rulers and the European colonial powers. Of course, we cannot go in any depth because it's a long story, but it's a story of violence also and, asymmetry in power. So the independence was reached in steps in the first half of the 20th century, culminating with the revolution of 1952-53. So what I usually think about the story of papyrology and papyrus collecting since the very beginning is that it might be broadly divided into three phases. I call the first phase the phase of, the colonial phase. It goes from the arrival of the French troops and it ends with the independence. Of course, it's a long period. Many things happened in the meanwhile. Here is the period where explorers, diplomats, and adventurers were searching for papyri in two main ways, that is archaeological excavations, legal and illegal, and of course acquisitions on the market, again legal and illegal. Then there is a post-colonial brackets phase, because I do think that this post-colonial phase that goes from the 50s, let's say, to 2011, that for me was a breaking point, is very post-colonial in chatting and, thinking about great visions and so forth on, but, it's a little bit slower in catching up with facts. That is, I haven't seen really transformative actions until recently, I must say. So this is also the phase where international conventions and national legislation finally stated that things that are Egyptians have to stay in Egypt, full stop, somehow. And then there was 2011 that we all, especially those of you who were in the field before and after, saw the outcomes. Of course, the chaos brought about by the political instability increased the numbers of, very highly questionable and violent actions, violent towards the objects, but also towards the people, because we also saw cases in which archaeological guards were shot, and also cases in which children were excavating in shafts to, collect as much as they could to feed the market that was booming, and some of them were killed, others were injured in many ways. I think that many archaeologists, especially the Egyptians, testified what was happening. I want to recall Monica Anna, that has done a lot to expose what was happening. So these are roughly the dates that somehow are the key dates from what I have understood so far. And as you can see, the story of this codex, as we know it so far, stretches from the 30s, so perhaps the early 20th century, till the 60s of the same century. So somehow it intersects, the first and second phase. Of course, as many of you have recalled in their papers, it was kind of normal to behave like Chester, Beatty, and others have behaved, right? And especially academics, where, the interfacing powers between the field, the dealers, so Egypt, and Europe and North America. So this is a very interesting thing to think about. But there were laws. I have here a sort of summary of the main legislation. There were laws even before 1912, which is, the core law we need to think about when thinking about the provenance. And then, of course, all the legislation that went about when Egypt became finally, after stages, independent. So what were these laws saying? So according to the 1912 set of laws, because there were laws and ministries, ordinance, and so on, trading in antiquities was legal, but highly regulated. So there were licenses, of course, I will give you just an outline, for shops. So like people like Naaman had a license. And also market stalls. The dealers with the shops needed to get a license from the Antiquities Service, need to keep inventories checked by the Antiquities Service, must not move antiquities from the shops. This is another thing that is interesting and must be brought in mind also, because many of them actually started traveling to Europe or the US to show material around. If they wish to do so if they wished to travel, they had to obtain a permission, again, from the Antiquities Service. Market stalls, again, needed licenses and can only sell small, cheap objects. It was set a price like in Egyptian liras. Buyers in this context could only buy legal antiquities through licensed sellers and could take them out of the country only with formal licenses released by the Antiquities Service, and all the expenses for the exports and so forth, so on. Now, you would find in some articles and commentaries on the law that, as a matter of fact, foreigner residents in Egypt were somehow outside this law. Why? Because during the negotiations between Egypt and basically the British mainly, before the the revolution, it was established that there was a fight on who had, the right to administer justice. And the Europeans came out with this General Assembly of the Mixed Court that not only were in charge of administering justice when foreigners were involved, but had also to somehow accept a law as valid. And of course, the 1912 law was not accepted as valid. However, there are court law court proceedings that are showing that actually some British citizens were actually prosecuted and found guilty. So one thing is the law in principle, but then we see that in practice there was a wish for the Egyptians to be, in control of their cultural heritage. Then in 1951-53, the antiquities laws became tighter, and the trade, as a matter of fact, was destined to end. So the antiquities by this point cannot be considered private property, with few exceptions. That is, the partage system that paid somehow those who obtained a license to excavate in Egypt had as a price, as a sort of recognition for the research they've done, a part of the fines that had always to be agreed with the Antiquities Service. And by the 50s, after the Tutankhamun and other scandals, rules became, of course, tighter. Always you needed a license to export, you had to pay taxes and so forth, so on. Museum duplicates and deaccessions were still possible, so that was a way eventually to acquire antiquities. Stalls licenses were destined to end in 1 year, so everything in that respect became illegal, and shop licenses were still conceded, but sourcing new items for dealers became de facto impossible. Also because we have to bear in mind that while in the first half of the century, actually some dealers obtained licenses to excavate, so that was a way for them to have legal antiquities on sale. By this point, the story has ended somehow. So where are we in this story now? First of all, there's a key fact. To be traded, any antiquity since 1912 had to be legal, meaning obtained through legal excavations and partage, or through acquisitions or museum duplicates and deaccessions, as I said before. So a chance finding brought to a dealer was illegal, because according to the law, 1912 and following, anyone who found an antiquity by chance had to report this to the Antiquities Service or the closest government officer by 6 days, according to the 1912 law, and immediately according to an ordinance of 1951. So this makes clear that we are facing, quite a case. So where are we now with our codex? The first fact I wanted to highlight is that the institutions and scholars involved in this exhibition and study have done an excellent job. They have brought to light all they could to clarify the provenance of the surviving pages in their custody. This is not banal. Transparency is not banal. Actually, it would have been considered either irrelevant or even outrageous in some environments until recently. So I'm delighted that we are moving forward in this respect, and we acknowledge what has happened to this object, and more in general, in the history of papyrology and papyrus collecting. I think that all the institutions that currently have the custody and the stewardship of the extant pages of our codex might wish to think about some issues the provenance story tells us. There are winners and losers in this story. Winners are the collections which got hold of the codex pages, and the scholars, citizens, and audiences that have benefited in many ways from these possibly illegal, well, most probably, say it, illegal acquisitions. And we are part of the lot. I feel I'm part of the lot. I'm here with you, right? Talking about this exceptional object. Among the losers, there is first and foremost the codex, which has lost pages on the way and now suffers from being dispersed in so many places. I mean, we can talk about, with all the preoccupations that actually Brent has highlighted about this digital, fantastic world we live in, but the actual object is our primary, focus and concern. Scholarship, second loser is scholarship, which is different from scholars. Scholarship has been impaired by the loss of the archaeological find context, which has gone away forever, impossible to be recovered, and by all the damages the codex has suffered since then. And Brent's paper was clear about this. There are questions that are lingering around that would have been, easier to answer if this codex would have been excavated perhaps 50 years later or, tomorrow, and not back then. So we know a great deal about this item. We struggled, you guys struggled also, recovering what others have kept hidden for a long time, but do consider what we could have gained through a legal excavation is what Ariella Zulai calls potential history. We have to acknowledge, the loss. Finally, losers are the Egyptians, who were not given the possibility to decide freely what to do with their cultural heritage, as they were fighting to survive the power game the Ottoman Empire and European powers were playing at the time. Even those Egyptians who benefited from the immediate sale are losers, and the story of Farag, the Beni Hassan dealer, is just perfect in that way, as they were not paid the price the object would have obtained in Europe. They were cheap. So, since papyrologists, as many other specialists, keep 1970 or 1972, 73, whatever, the UNESCO Convention as a sort of watershed, we are in sort of good waters for us, right? That is, this object has been out of Egypt since the 60s. So, in terms of the ethics of our profession, we can study it, well, we can decide to study it, and so forth, so on. But I would like you to go back and read really carefully the UNESCO Convention that I think that many of us didn't really read. it not only invites all nations to protect their cultural heritage and fight the illegal trade and export in antiquities, but also asks to repair past wrong doings. So here, the second part of this Article 2 says, to this end, the states parties undertake to oppose such practices, all the bad that we have seen, with the means at their disposal, and particularly by removing their causes, putting a stop to current practices, and by helping to make the necessary reparations, which I think is the key term here rather than restitution. So what is this reparative justice and reparations that I think might help us to think more in depth about this object? This is a concept actually that has become a thing among people expert in cultural heritage legislation that I think that we should read more carefully. And it's a concept that has been studied recently by Patty Gerstenblith, who is a professor of law at DePaul University. So reparations to descendants and descendant, I think we need really to read it aloud, communities, would be made not only for the initial justice of separation, but also for the continuing injustice of separation of people from their cultural heritage. I want you to think about one thing, that is, if an Egyptian scholar would decide to check this papyrus for real, he would have been, in trouble getting in some countries nowadays, and he would have even the economic issue because, as you know, salaries in Egypt are not our salaries. So I think that this theme about the separation is something. Therefore, making reparations to present individuals, communities, and states fits within the rubric of restorative justice and is compensating present-day victims in their own right, as well as in their role as representatives of past victims. Policy design of reparations here is based on 3 prongs: apology or acknowledgement. And we are already doing this because, what we've done here, the work of the curators, it's just amazing. Restitution, this object could be asked back at some point. I think that is something that we need to think about. And compensation, which includes additional damages and other forms of relief. So I am questioning anyone in this room. Do we believe in international institutions and international cooperation? Do we believe in justice, in the fact that our scholarship is part, our academic structures are embedded into a society that can take some path or other? So we really need to think about this. If the answer is yes, then my invitation is to think about reparative, active actions. So when you are thinking about sharing images, I'm thinking about, involving Egyptian colleagues in that, perhaps giving these digital images or anything else to some primary libraries, the Biblioteca Alexandrina and others in Egypt. Using this archaeological object as an example, I am also asking myself, but this is my own, the justice towards the object, that is, this object is kept separated. So this is something we need to think about. So what would be an act of reparation towards the nation from where the object was taken? Does Egypt deserve reparations? We might decide yes or not, but we have to think about it because we are the heirs of those who have benefited since more than, well, about a century now from the stewardship of this object. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have been here for a very long time. Hemos estado aquí mucho rato. And we are very grateful to Giorgos, Brent, Eric, Jill and Roberta. And todavía tenéis la exposición hasta el 1 de noviembre y quizá la alarguen. Así que, bueno, esperamos que esto haya contribuido a entender aún más este objeto tan excepcional. Muchas gracias a todos.
Gracias.